Today on the Pitchbook podcast, Zach is pitching Plain Honest Men by Richard Beeman. And I am pitching A Short History of Russia, How the World's Largest Country Invented Itself from the Pagans to Putin by Mark Liggett. Batter up! All right, Zach, as the listeners will know, we never tell each other what we're going to pitch until we actually get on the Zoom and get ready to call or get ready to record. So how funny is it that you picked Plain Honest Men, which is about the Constitution of the U.S., and I picked A Short History of Russia. So
here's why it's so great, because we usually don't go political on the podcast.
And mine's not political, other than it talks about the political, I guess, history of Russia to some degree. So mine is, like I said, it is a short history of Russia. It's a pretty short book. So I don't know if I should just go first and let's just do that. I'll go first, and then you can pontificate for a little bit. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here's why it's interesting this week, though.
Yeah.
So there was an article by the New York Times that said the Constitution is sacred. Is it also dangerous?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm like, this would be a great book. And then there's also like talk about Russian influence in podcasting this week. And
that's true. Yeah.
I can't wait.
So mine might be a little bit interesting then. So
yeah, let's do
it. So the part of the problem, as you know, is like we read these and how can you even like really put, get the Reader's Digest version of a book, right? But this is again, I listen to books. It's about 5 hours long, so it's not super long. And it definitely burns quickly through the history, right? Because they're talking pagans, the first like thing that they've ever found written like on sticks or something,
Oh, really?
like in 10,000 I think it was like 1,000 AD or something like that. Is like the first kind of written things they found in Russia. Anyway, so it's pretty. So you got the pagans that are there, like, and again, part of this is just how huge Russia is. It's, all the way in Europe, all the way down to almost the Middle East, basically, all the way over to Asia. So you have all kinds of different cultural influences. And anyway, it talks about how Russia went from like serfs and small little villages to somebody kind of organizing power a little bit. And again, I can't possibly go into all the details, but it's nice how kind of quickly he goes over it, but in a way it's kind of one of the weaknesses, right? And he kind of admits that. He's like, look, if you can't get into super detail. But what's cool is at the end of each chapter, he gives you additional reading, like books that he thinks are really helpful for those specific topics that he talked about.
Yeah.
And then he gets into like Peter the Great and Catherine. Again, I'm not going to go too much into detail. First of all, because I don't know if I remember it all or could give a very good summary of it. But what I liked about it was he kept kind of hitting home this I guess theme of how Russia would kind of tend to call on its history and then adjust what they wanted to be the story that they wanted going forward. And how they would basically say, and he would often give like a story that was maybe apocryphal, right? Like, we're not sure exactly if the story is quite right, but oh, by the way, Putin took the story and kind of twisted this part of actual history to fit what he wants. So did Peter the Great. So did Catherine. You know what I mean? They talk about the Mongols taking over. Anyway, it's pretty crazy and interesting if as kind of a snapshot, right, of Russia. What was interesting to me, especially since you and I did that whole doubleheader on the gulags. He doesn't really mention him at all. The only thing he talks about was pretty early, and I think this is pretty relevant. And I can't remember if it was like Peter the Great or somebody, but basically they say, look, in order to stay powerful, and Catherine was like, let's look to Europe and try to be more European. And anyway, there's various times when they try to say, oh no, we're more our own thing. We're not really European. We kind of hate Europe. Anyway, they they talked about, and I'm sorry, I can't remember what leader it was, but they basically said, look, we need to have everybody as serfs. Essentially, everything they do needs to go towards the military buildup of Russia. So like, and again, this is probably the 1800s, but there was something about 90 to 95% of all the essentially the money that Russia was earning was going towards the military. So like so essentially it was kind of like, oh, this is like the early seeds of the gulag where it doesn't matter. Our people are our resources, right? Like we don't, it doesn't matter, it's like, no, you have a farm, that's cool. 95% you can keep for yourself and eat and hopefully survive. But the other 95%, that's got to go towards building up the military to fight with Sweden or whatever, at the time.
Oh, so the tax was
Well,
95%.
it's not even tax. It's like just that's just how it was, right? Like and that he does talk about that in kind of the pagan times where
Mhm.
there'd be little villages and then almost like he describes it as like protection money, like bullying, where they're like, no, you give us your stuff
We'll
and then
protect you.
we'll make sure your village stays intact, from whoever. So does that make sense? Like I guess it was
Yeah.
taxation for lack of a
Yep.
better word, but it's I don't know how formal it was, but anyway, so that just reminded me like where they were kind of planting the seeds for the gulags, where that just essentially never stopped. Like, okay, well,
Yeah.
if we're going to build this up, we only thing we have is millions and millions of people. Let's put them to work in the prison camp. So anyway, it was interesting. Probably the stuff that you and I grew up with Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union was probably more, I don't know if relevant, but obviously that's the stuff that I grew up, being a part of a history. So that, and again, it's pretty short, but uh, anyway, it was just really cool. I thought it was a great book. He definitely hits on every topic, but again, how do you put into a nutshell the
Kind of
history of
like a
this giant?
highlights.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the one thing I don't know that I loved, and maybe this is because my lack of knowledge, but before each chapter, he would do like dates like 1864. I'm making up these, or maybe it was like, okay, 1700s. Peter the Great does this. I'm sorry, 1774, 1777. Catherine takes over. 1779, something, something. So he's giving these highlights of dates, but I have no, concept of what he's talking about. And then he
Right.
will go back in the chapter and say, okay, this is kind of what I was talking about with those dates. But since I have such a small knowledge of all those older, especially the older stuff, like I just didn't even know what he was talking about. Now,
Yeah.
again, that's my ignorance. So, it's nothing against him, but like I said, I do think it's cool. He gives uh, fairly flavorful recommendations for further reading. So he'll say, "This is really good if you specifically want to know about Catherine the Great." And you could read all her letters, but just a heads up that like her letters are going to be her own version of the story. You know what I mean? So and he'll say this one's really good and a humorous way to look at this and that. So he does give actually some really cool, interesting, in other words, if you were super into like getting reading
Hmm.
all this information, he'll give you some good suggestions like, oh, you know what, that one actually sounds really good to me. That one not so much. So anyway, I would say for me it's probably a triple, but you'd have to be kind of like, hey, I'm kind of interested in this subject, which I am. Um, and yeah. Anyway, I don't know what else to say about
What was there anything in the book that really stuck out to you or something that you learned that you didn't know before that was kind of surprising?
it. It's a good question. Uh, I guess I guess probably what I mentioned about the 95% of all their gross domestic product or whatever was
Yeah,
going
their
towards the
GDP.
military. Yeah, it
Yeah,
was
that's
like,
crazy.
uh, just because it resonated with me, like, okay, this is just the way they do things, right? Like, there's no such thing as a free market
Right.
that makes sense. Um, so anyway, that was probably the most surprising thing. The other thing that was I guess, kind of interesting to me, especially right now with again, we try to talk about politics, but what's interesting is the war in Ukraine right now. Basically Kiev is kind of the home of Russia, for lack of a better word. Obviously, it's Ukraine, but like, and again, that region is so huge. You have literally
Well, and it's been like
thousands of
broken
different
apart.
cultures.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but basically Kiev is kind of the the home of like where Russia started, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
And I don't want to say Russia, but uh, you know what I mean, just because of not to disrespect the
Well,
Ukrainians.
historically, if you look
Yeah,
at the borders and
yeah,
boundaries, I mean, Russia was like way further east,
yeah, yeah. The Rus people is what it
further
is.
west, excuse
Yeah,
me.
so
Yeah.
the Rus people, that's why it's called Russia, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, but that maybe that stuck out to me too is like the history kind of starts with Kiev. So anyway,
Yeah. I think
uh, go
that's a
ahead.
really those are important books to read, because when I read the news, like there was an interview with I think Tucker Carlson and Putin, and as he's like going through the history of Russia, I'm thinking, I don't know if any of this is true. I don't know,
Right,
right?
right,
Like unless you have actually studied the history by
right.
somebody who's apolitical, it's like how do you have an opinion about something you haven't read about? So that's
Right.
nice that he put some books in there that you could
Yeah.
go back and did you feel like there was any political push one way or
No,
another,
no,
or it
not at
was
all.
just
No, it
like
was
here's the
actually really
history?
cool. Like,
When was it
I
written?
mean, it was like it's fairly recent because he talks about Putin, right? So,
Okay.
um,
Yeah. Well,
he
he's been in a while.
that's true. He did say, okay, so he did. I didn't now. I apologize for not knowing, but he did say that in 2024, in theory, Vladimir Putin is supposed to be done. But they're like, well, and then he actually says, does he do something to make it so that he can stick around, or
Yes.
will he, or does he kind of like get a crony to take over for him? So I actually meant to research that and say, oh, is that what's going on? Because it is 2024. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
is Putin going to still be around? I didn't even. I probably should research this, but so
for
that
sure.
gives you an idea. It's probably 2020, 2021 or something like that.
Yeah.
And he does. It's not political, other than for him to talk about like how Gorbachev basically was like a reformer, and then Putin basically says like, no, we're not doing that. You know what I mean? Like we're going back to the old style. So that's what
Gotcha.
he. That's the way. In that way, it's political, but not like and that's bad or and
Yeah.
that's good. He just says here's what happened. So
Right. Right.
anyway,
That's awesome.
okay. I'm gonna take my sweatshirt off because it's getting hot. I'm gonna put myself on mute. You start talking. Tell
All
us
right.
tell us
Go
how you
ahead.
found this book because you read this book a long time ago, right?
Heating
So
up. Yeah.
yeah,
So this
tell
book,
tell us
this
how you
book,
found it.
Plain Honest Men. I can't remember where I found the book. I think it was at a bookstore, and I saw it on a shelf, and I see Plain Honest Men. The subtitle is called The Making of the American Constitution. And if for those of you that are watching, this is a there it is. I like to read books. The this is like a hardcover book. It's got the American Eagle, and down at the bottom it has a picture of the founding fathers all kind of sitting around a table. They're drafting a document. Oh, you're on mute. Go ahead.
I like how you're showing the book because people really were actually watching me take off my shirt. My shirt is what they were
Well,
enjoying.
I was trying to
So
distract
yeah.
him a little bit. I'm just kidding.
Okay, so you saw this in a bookstore and just thought the book cover was cool. Is that
Yeah,
what I
I
heard?
just
Okay.
it's been a while since I've read it, but I saw that and I remember reading it thinking this is probably one of those founding books that people should read in
Right.
high school.
Right.
But it's maybe a little bit dense. It is a biography, so he pulls together all of the different complexities of the founders. They're all coming from different parts of their life. You've got
Hmm.
Franklin, who's 81, and this is the Constitutional Convention. So the Revolutionary War has happened, is over, and now we're in let's see, 1787. So 1776 was the Declaration of Independence.
Hmm.
So we're now about 11 years after the
Oh, see,
Revolutionary
this is
War.
how bad I am at whatever school I went to when you're learning about the Constitution. I didn't know it was ratified 11 years, 12 years after
Yeah,
the Declaration. I didn't know that. That's
yeah,
crazy.
yeah. They're putting all this together.
If you had said, "Hey, Matt, when was the Constitution passed?" 1776. Well, of course.
Right. No, no, no.
I'm a
No, that
red-blooded
was
American.
way
I
later.
know.
That was way later. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
But you think about it, 11 years
Yeah,
after. I mean,
it's
it
a
was
long
such a
time.
mess. And I think they were frustrated and realized we need some kind of national governing document. So he goes through great lengths giving some history on Franklin and Washington and kind of the main figureheads that came together. So there are five things my five things from the book that I pulled. I'm
Zach's
going to
five
dive
things. I
my
like it.
five things.
You know
I'm
what?
going to
We
dive
should call that the five tool player, right? You're the five tool
the
player
five
for
tool
like
player.
baseball,
Here we
right?
go. All right. But I'm going to jump into two of them that were really contentious. That if these things had not been worked through, it
Hmm.
would not have happened. And I look at the Constitution, this book, as I'm reading it, trying not to have any presentism, because we look at
Okay,
the world
right.
we live in today, and we
Yeah,
live much differently. Obviously, we don't have slavery, which
yeah.
was awful and terrible.
But
So
common at the time in
yeah, I'm
1787.
like, okay, this is the first time that something like this has been done. They're bringing these people together that have totally different perspectives,
Hmm.
that disagree on how things should be put in place, yet they're able to walk away from this convention and signing it, putting it into law. And I just look at the world that we're in today in the United States. I mean,
Right.
it's pretty good. If you don't think it's good in the US, go visit some other country outside of the US and then come back. It's pretty good.
Yes.
So, all right, the five things. So, compromise and conflict. So he highlights the compromises that shaped the Constitution. So they had intense debates on representation, state sovereignty, the balance of power between large and small states, which is called the Great Compromise.
Hmm.
They were trying to figure that out. I'll dive into this just for a second. So the Great Compromise, you had Roger Sherman of Connecticut. He blended these two plans together. So there's an argument of should how what larger states should have greater representation, and there's a feeling that no, smaller states should have the same or equal
So
representation.
do they mean larger geographically or larger population?
Population,
Okay.
population, yeah, larger population. And again, they're doing this for the first time. So how do you tax people? How do you make sure that everyone is represented fairly and
Hmm.
states have equal say in things? So they came up with this bicameral structure where you have a House of Representatives that is population based,
Hmm.
benefiting larger states with larger populations, have more representatives, and then you
Yep.
have the Senate with two senators from each state, giving equal, equality. Uh, which was a genius idea. So
Hmm.
Roger Sherman, he brought that forward of Connecticut, blended that together, and that was the Great Compromise.
Okay, time out for
Okay.
1 second. And again,
Yeah.
not to get political, but could you imagine if there was only the House of Representatives and there was no
Oh,
Senate?
well, there'd be like four states.
Yeah,
You'd have like California,
yeah, California, New York,
New York,
Texas,
Texas,
Florida. I don't know the populations, but
maybe. Yeah. I mean, it really wouldn't
like that's
matter
who decides.
if
It's
you're in
just
Utah. I
exactly
reading this, I'm like, our senators from Utah are
critical
very powerful, right?
and critical to
We
us.
only
So
have like four representatives in
yeah,
Congress.
yeah, exactly.
You'd while I'm talking, look up California, see how many they have. And I think during the pandemic, they lost a couple in California, but
Yeah,
to them,
because
it's
everyone
like,
moved.
so what? We have so many. So that was one of the issues that they had to work through. The so there's a lot of compromise. No one felt like it was a perfect document. Um, Each of the founders had different motives, ranging from protecting property rights and preventing tyranny to ensuring the survival of the Union. While some delegates saw a strong central government, others feared it might lead to an overreach of power. And it's interesting because today I feel like we have the same conversations. What
Hmm.
issues should be back at the state level? What issues should remain at the federal level? And we have these you know big powerful debates, but it's interesting that they were thinking about those things, about states' rights and centrality of the federal government. um, One of the other like the maybe the big issue here is slavery and moral contradictions. So here they're setting up a document that's based on liberty and equality, and yet it doesn't do anything to free slaves. That's why I
Hmm.
think the Constitution was a good first step to resolving that issue. 80 years after, of course, we have the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. But this was at least a good first step to create an environment where slavery would not exist. I don't think in reading this book that the Constitution would have been passed had they not come up with some kind of compromise. And so they had the three-fifths law
Mm-hmm.
where the southern states wanted for slaves to have three-fifths representation,
But not actually vote.
but not
Right.
actually, yeah, no representation, right? Like
Exactly. Right.
zero representation, but it
Right.
would give the slaveholders more power and
Right.
more
Because they were
control.
probably less populated, I'm assuming, as far
That's
as
right. That's right. Just super interesting. And the North felt like, well, that's unfair because they don't have rights. So you shouldn't be able to vote for them on their behalf
right.
because they don't have any rights.
Yeah.
And so that's just even going back to the Constitutional Convention, this debate was happening. It
Hmm.
was already active and it wasn't resolved until 80 years later. And earlier this year, I pitched a book on Frederick Douglass during
Hmm.
that time.
Exactly.
So eventually that gets resolved. And I think, we're still working through
Through
things.
great bloodshed, it got resolved.
Great,
Right.
great. Yeah, great
So
bloodshed.
update on California. Looks like
Okay,
we have
let's hear it.
52 representatives, and then Utah has
So
four.
Utah's four.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So 52.
So
Okay.
good
Sorry.
job.
Yep.
Good job, Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Thank you for the great compromise.
Yes.
So that was a big issue. The three-fifths compromise was a big issue.
Hmm.
I don't think anyone today would look back and think, well, the three-fifths compromise, that was great. It wasn't great.
Right.
But again, I don't know that we would even have had a constitution
Right.
had that not happened. So I don't know. It's like, I guess in life we aim for progression, not perfection. I don't know. But reading the book, he works through those things
Hmm.
and kind of helps you better understand what the framers were thinking about,
At the
what
time, it
concerns
makes,
were at
yeah.
the time. Yeah,
Yeah. It's a great
at
point
their
to bring
time.
up how we look through history with our lens instead of like what was happening at the time, right? Like,
We totally do. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's called presentism, where we just
Yeah.
take our values, how we live today, and we're like
Right.
those guys.
Yeah. Genghis Khan, what a horrible guy, right? Like,
Well,
yeah.
in history, violence is pretty common. I mean,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
every
Oh, for sure.
civilization.
For sure.
So we live pretty calm, peaceful, stable, AC conditioned lives, I think, compared to history.
Sure.
So two of the main characters in the book that he spends quite a bit of time on, one is George Washington. They didn't feel like they could have this convention without him present.
Hmm.
And it's just really ironic because Washington really didn't say much during the convention, but
Hmm.
his presence, they could sense he had a lot of gravitas. He's
Yeah.
like the general during the Revolutionary War. And we just before we started recording, you were talking about how Washington had been shot four times
Hmm.
even before he was made a general. Like one shot through his hat, a couple
Right.
through his coat, just absolutely um, led the nation through the Revolutionary War. But his presence during the convention was a powerful force, and so Beeman talks a lot about how that helped for things to move forward. I think people felt an obligation to get a constitution done with Washington there.
Hmm.
Otherwise, it's like all that sacrifice and struggle. What was it for?
Right.
So he talks about just Washington's restrained leadership. So he didn't say a lot. He didn't voice a lot of opinion as much as others did, but his presence there was pretty powerful. The second individual was Benjamin Franklin, who at some point I'll pitch a book. There's an awesome book on Benjamin Franklin's life by Walter Isaacson, who
Mm. Does Steve
is
Jobs and yeah,
yeah,
done
Steve
tons.
Jobs, Da Vinci,
Right.
Elon. He just released a book on Elon Musk.
Mhm.
He does one on Benjamin Franklin, which is an awesome read.
I'm excited for the Zach Hewish book from him. It's going to be really
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
it's going to
waiting
be great.
for Walter to call me. I'm happy to fill him in on my amazing inventions. Um, but Franklin was pretty involved, and if you read his biography, he's pretty cunning. He's good at reading people, sizing people. I think good at getting deals done, building
And
relationships.
do you say he was 81 or so at the time?
He was 81.
Wow,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And some of these guys are young. They're in their 20s,
Right, right.
in Washington. I can't remember how old he was, but I think Franklin was on the other end, 81 years old. So you've got some of the
Yeah.
leadership from the Revolutionary War. You've got leadership from each of the states coming into this. So just this blend of men that are trying to figure out what is this going to look like. And I think the product they came out with, again, given all the complexity of the time, they did a pretty amazing job. Um, there's this quote that Franklin leaves everybody with. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. So, one of the most poignant moments in the book is Franklin's speech on the final day of the convention. In it, he urged his fellow delegates to sign the Constitution, even if they had personal objections or doubts. Franklin himself
Hmm,
acknowledged that the document was imperfect.
hmm,
I would agree, but argued that no constitution could be perfect. He
mhm,
emphasized the necessity of humility and compromise, saying that, quote, the opinions I have of its errors, I sacrifice to the public good, end quote. His speech was delivered by another delegate due to his frailty, but its impact was profound. So Franklin's able to govern. I think the balance between Franklin being an active voice, Washington's presence,
mhm.
helped to keep the momentum moving forward for everyone to finally agree and sign this Constitution that has been amended several times
But
since the
does
founding
he talk
document.
about the first 10 amendments? Does he
He
talk about
does,
that?
yeah.
Okay. So it looks like
The
they're ratified a couple years afterwards or something. Two, three
Yeah,
years.
yeah. He spent some time, I think, towards that, but most of the time is on the actual convention.
But what you're saying is they're encouraged to sign it now because and compromise, but then ultimately this Bill of Rights becomes an issue too, and they said we need to do these amendments later.
Yes,
Got it.
yeah, and that's right. I mean, I think they recognize it's not a perfect document, but it's a
Hmm.
good start,
Right.
and gave away a means by which the Constitution can be amended. I was
Hmm.
listening to somebody the other day. I would say that's maybe left of center, more of a populist.
Hmm.
And it's interesting to me that the states have the ability, I believe it's three-quarters of the states
Hmm.
can come together and pass laws without Congress.
Hmm.
And I'm kind of shocked that there's some things that we haven't done that as states. There's several things like, funding campaigns. That seems to just be kind of wild how much
Hmm.
money is spent on campaigns today. Um, so it'll be interesting going forward. What other amendments will we make to the Constitution? What other changes will we see, um, in our lifetime?
Hmm.
And it's a beautiful process. It's super messy. It's never easy. Everyone comes with strong opinions and feelings.
Hmm.
But I thought the problems that we have today existed in their day, yet they were able to come together and pass something imperfect.
Hmm.
And that is how negotiations are supposed to work. So, highly recommend Plain Honest Men. It was a home run. I just love that it brought in all the different characters of the Constitution Convention and gave me a lot of insight. He also talks about after the convention they'd go to dinner. They'd go eat out at a restaurant and
Nice.
shared some of the letters that Washington was writing, and it's pretty interesting just to get a peek into their lives back in the day. There wasn't X or Instagram or email or Zoom.
I see Benjamin Franklin being an Instagram influencer for sure.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
He'd have so many
Everybody would have bald
followers.
heads with a mullet, like,
I
that's what
think
everyone,
even today, if
it's
he
little
were,
spectacles.
yeah, if he were to come back today, I think he would still be just as popular as he was then. Just an absolute awesome guy.
Funny. All
So
right, so what do you rate
there
it?
you go. I give it a home run. I
Okay.
think this is a book. This is one of those books and that is a home run. I think everyone should read it
Mm-hmm.
so that you have an appreciation of where the country got its legal start.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good base. And there's a lot of other wars and history to read, but that's the fundamental foundation upon
Mm-hmm.
the start of the principles that they were trying to put together.
Yeah.
And I also am grateful and recognize how fragile that time was.
Mm-hmm.
Like the
Well, yeah,
nation
yeah,
11
you're
years
right.
after the war.
Oh, Maine and Massachusetts, we're just our own country now, right? Like
Right, right.
kind of
Yeah. We
like we're basically we could easily have been Europe, right? Like where each state is its own government in its own place, and you know what I mean? It could have been that.
yeah. And I think there is wisdom, and we're still trying to find what is that balance between what issues should be at the state level and what things
Oh
should
yeah,
be at the federal level. Um, but I do think there should be a state, and I do think there should be a federal government. It's just like what power should exist with,
yeah,
how central should it be, or how decentralized should each state be?
right. And that's as
So
deep as we get politically, just
that's
to
it.
stay out of
I'll
trouble.
stop there. So highly recommend it. It's a great book. I'll probably read it again as we head into the election, maybe one more time, just to.
You can't do that. You got too many books on the stack
That's true.
on the pile of shame that you need to start working on.
I actually do have about 4 books right now. I'm breaking my own rules because I usually don't buy a book until I finish the one
Ah,
I'm reading. But the one I'm reading right now is pretty dense, and I couldn't resist on a couple other books, so I picked them up.
who was it that we talked about that said they're always reading like 3 books at a time? Or maybe I just read that somewhere and I
I
can't
think
remember who it
that's
was.
everybody.
But yeah, there was some guy who specifically read 3 books. I want to say Munger or somebody like that that
Oh,
said I
oh,
always
oh,
read 3 books at a time to get some sort of various opinions going
variety.
on.
Yeah.
Variety. I don't know
Well,
what it was.
I mean, I do that. I have one on Libby. I have one on. I'm actually reading a fiction book right now.
Whoa, what's
Yeah,
gotten into you?
I'm getting 2 in this year.
I love
Called
it.
I won't ever pitch it, but it's called Red Rising. Have you ever read that or heard of
No,
it?
nope.
Kind of
I'll
kind
wait
of
for the
interesting.
movie. Wait for the
Yeah,
movie.
there will be a movie.
I like to watch my fiction, generally speaking. So,
It's kind of like Dune
okay.
story, but
Yeah.
it's like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are a couple of like franchises, whether they're like video games or something, that I've read fiction books of or listened to, I should say.
Yeah.
So there'll be a few of those, but it's not very common for me for sure. So anyway, all
Yeah.
right. Well, that is it. Thanks for that. That was funny that we had Russia and the U.S. Today.
USA.
Definitely
USA.
pro USA for sure. So yeah, like Zach said, if you don't like it here, go check out a few other countries. And there's some great countries out there, but there are also some ones that will make you appreciate the US for sure. So with that said, thanks for listening to the Pitchbook Podcast. Thanks for everybody like and subscribe. Tell your friends. If you want to be a guest on the show, you got to let us know, and we'll let you be a relief pitcher. And thanks again, obviously, to Deja Vega for letting us use the music. Go check them out. That's about it. Thanks, everyone. And we'll catch you next time on the Pitchbook Podcast.